Welcome to the second module of the four-part series, Crossover Prevention Case Planning for Child Welfare Workers. I'm Lauren Beal, Senior Program Manager at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. In our last session, we discussed the communities that are disproportionately impacted by crossover from the child welfare system into the juvenile justice system, and some of the warning signs that will help you identify youth who are on a pathway to crossover. In this session, we will talk about how we can assess the strengths, needs, and socio-historical context of young people in our caseloads. The goal of this module is to help you identify the strengths, needs, and socio-historical context that should be considered in developing a case plan with a young person and why it is important to identify these factors. We'll be working in our workbook throughout the module. You can download the workbook from our website and work in it as a fillable PDF or print it out to fill out by hand. To start, on page 11, take a moment to record in your workbook some of the important factors that you consider when managing a case plan. Every young person has unique factors in their life that provide them with either protection from the chaos that life throws at them or the skills to mitigate the impact of that chaos on their life. Young people also have experiences and situations that make it navigating and responding to life more difficult. In the workbook, there are several activities on page 12 and 13 that you can complete at the end of the session to further clarify strengths and needs. Everyone has areas in their life where they need greater support or need guidance to grow. This is particularly true for young people in the child welfare system. Neither research nor practice has clearly distinguished between risk and need. Within your community, they might be called needs, risks, or used interchangeably. For the purpose of this conversation, we will use risk to describe those factors that we cannot change that put a young person at greater likelihood of crossover, and a need to describe those factors that we can change. We specifically refer to risks as static risks. These are things we cannot change because they have occurred, and we can't go back and change the past. Examples can include parental incarceration, age at which they entered the child welfare system, or a history of delinquency. In contrast, our needs are dynamic. These are things that can be changed, and by working to change these dynamic needs, we can change and reduce the likelihood of crossover. Examples can include school performance, caregiver involvement, peer relationships, and a young person's feelings around their sexual and gender identities. We are going to focus on the needs as we go forward because you need to address these. Just as everyone has areas where they need support, everyone also has strengths or protective factors. Strengths can take many different forms for different people. If a young person loves to create art, this art can also be a pro-social activity that helps them re-engage with others and school, as well as express their needs and worries. Helping young people in the child welfare system grow their strength and learn how to use their strengths to live their best life is just as important as identifying needs. We now have an understanding of what is meant by strengths and needs, but just how do we identify them? To identify strengths and needs, you should be using a validated tool or assessment. Strengths and needs tools can do a lot of things. Not every instrument has the same capability. Some are more sophisticated than others. However, they are all cut from the same cloth. So we can identify several similarities among all screeners and assessments that identify needs for further evaluation and services and strengths. We must also always ask young people what it is they want and need and truly listen to why they want or do not want specific services. Too often we stop at the assessment and believe we have all the information needed to determine what is best for a young person. Young people should be treated as partners with an equal voice in determining services. By asking youth directly what they want and connecting them to the services that they want, you build trust with the youth. Establish baseline buy-in for the service and for future services you want to refer the youth to. And you allow for growth in the young person's personal ownership and responsibility of their own lives. When we know what a young person's strengths and needs are, we can identify how to build up their strengths to decrease some of the harmful effects of their needs. Knowing this information helps us to focus on the needs a young person has that can be changed. We can assess severity of need to focus our responses on what is most urgently needed. By partnering with youth and identifying their needs and strengths, you begin to build a trusting relationship with the young person. These transformative relationships can have the power to change the lives of the young people you work with. These relationships can help youth see and feel that they matter, that they have the power to change their lives for the better. Ultimately, it is the responsibility of the child welfare system to help young people in their care thrive. By assessing their strengths and needs and by talking with them, youth workers will be better able to identify what services and supports would be of greatest benefit to a young person. Take a moment to imagine the community of one of the young people you work with. When you imagine this space, what do you see in their community? What do you hear? What does it smell like? As we discuss the socio-historical context, use your workbook to make note of your own personal socio-historical context using the questions provided on page 14. To truly understand a young person's strengths and needs, case managers must also filter those strengths and needs through the lens of the young person's socio-historical context. Every person exists within their own socio-historical context. The socio-historical context is these two outside circles. It is the combination and interplay of how our society, our history, our policies, both past and present, all interact to shape and form our communities. This context then influences our relationships and our experiences as an individual. For example, past policies that resulted in a school in one neighborhood receiving more funding than a school in another neighborhood continue to impact the communities and individuals in each neighborhood today. Let's dig in a little further to how we can help identify a young person's socio-historical context. To identify the socio-historical context, case managers can use questions developed by Dr. Wendy Shaya in SHARP, a framework for addressing the context of poverty and oppression during service provision in the United States. To understand the social context a young person lives in, we can ask, is their community a food desert? Do they lack access to transportation? How are the schools, both their physical condition and the quality of the education they provide? Is there affordable housing in the community? Are there jobs that pay a living wage? The historical context are the ways in which history continues to impact and shape a young person's community and daily life. To identify the historical context, we can ask, is there a history of housing discrimination in the neighborhood? Does the person's community have a history of expressing frustration and hopelessness through civil unrest, violence, crime, and substance use? And then we want to consider what impact these factors have on the young person. Does this socio-historical context impact a young person's belief that change is possible? How might the context impact trust, coping, conflict management, self-esteem, hope, personal and collective agency, and their belief in a positive future? It is not uncommon for our case planning and service provision to focus on needs and behaviors of the individual young person and the impact of their relationships with the people around them, but ignore the impact of their built environment, the quality of their education, and how society treats them. Particularly, we ignore the direct impact of poverty and oppression on how young people behave. Many of the risks or needs a young person may present with are directly related to their socio-historical context, and we cannot understand their true needs if we are unable to discern and distinguish between the impact of their environment and their actual needs. It is necessary to provide therapeutic services, strengthen families, and identify protective factors. But focusing solely on these activities is like pulling a drowning person out of the water, checking their breathing, getting their pulse back up, seeing how their body is responding, and then throwing them back in the water. We need to address the individual behaviors, but also address the structures and systems that are the root causes of their behaviors as well. Before we close out with our workbook activity, thank you for joining us to discuss how we can identify the strengths and needs of young people before they cross over, as well as understand the socio-historical context, which are the root causes of many of their needs. In the next session, we will work on using these strengths and needs to develop a case management plan. Before you start the next module, open your workbook to page 16, review the case notes, and the CANS assessment to identify Rubin's strengths, needs, and socio-historical context.